Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a very famous game played between Alexander Alekhine and Samuel Reshevsky. This was played in the 1937 Kamari International Tournament in Kamari, Latvia, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Alekhine starts off by playing e4 and knight f6 by Reshevsky, so the Alekhine defense. e5, knight to d5, d4, and d6. And this is all quite normal in the Alekhine defense, and after usually moves like c4 by white and knight b6, there are a ton of ways that white can continue. He could play f4, he could play knight to f3, he could even just play e takes d6. But instead of going for c4, Alekhine decides to play knight f3, and he's just developing his knight, and soon he might get ideas of playing bishop c4, bishop g4 by Reshevsky, pinning the knight, and this is all quite normal. c4, knight b6, and bishop to e2. And here we have a trade on the e5 square, and knight takes e5. And here, Reshevsky finds a way that he can actually win a pawn. He plays bishop takes e2. And the point of this is that he's either going to win a pawn, or he's going to get Alekhine unable to castle. If queen takes e2, which was what was played in the game, then Reshevsky just wins the d4 pawn. And if king takes e2, then obviously Alekhine cannot castle, and the position would just get uglier from there. So queen takes e2 was forced, giving up a pawn, but this does allow Alekhine to get a lot of development in. Knight 8 to d7, offering to trade some knights. Knight takes d7, knight takes d7, and knight c3. Trying to, yet again, get more development, and we can obviously tell that Reshevsky is more or less likely to castle on the queen side. But instead, Reshevsky plays c6. So this means that Reshevsky is getting ready to castle queenside, maybe bring his knight into c5, or maybe play g6 and get a kingside attack on the castled white king. So bishop e3, queen e5, and rook a to d1, centralizing the rook, and also putting a bit of pressure on the d7 knight. e6 by Reshevsky, and queen to f3. And here, Reshevsky finally castles. Alekhine just grabs the pawn, and of course, many people have remembered games where your opponent's bishop will get trapped once you play b6, but unfortunately for Reshevsky, he can't do it in this scenario because after queen takes c6 check, queen c7, queen a8 check is present, and after knight to b8, you just lose after rook takes d8 check, and king or queen takes d8, and the queen will capture the knight on b8 with check. So it's not helpful to play the move b6, and instead Reshevsky admits that he gives up the pawn and plays queen a5. And what queen a5 is trying to do is maybe try to consider to play the move queen takes a2 later on after this knight moves, although it is best advised not to play queen takes a2, especially with a completely open a-file and your king completely exposed. So Reshevsky is just either trying to get his queen to defend or just try to create some counterplay on the opposite flank. Bishop d4, and now queen f5, offering a trade of queens, which, if Alekhine takes him up on that, would definitely lead to Reshevsky being maybe a bit worse, but still having a playable position. Queen g3 and e5. And why does Reshevsky play e5? Well, he wants to block out all pressure along this h2 b8 diagonal. And that is a very good move, just blocking out all the attacks on that diagonal. And now the considerable options for Reshevsky could be something like playing h5 and following up with g5 and trying to somehow get a kingside attack. So we have bishop to e3, and now bishop to b4. Not really trying to capture the knight on c3 because, yet again, you do have a completely open b-file. So knight a4, even though Alekhine knows that the knight cannot technically be captured, he still just moves the knight away, maybe trying to get the knight into b6, or play a3 and kick the bishop back and put his knight into very weak squares that Reshevsky cannot control. Bishop a5 guarding b6, and now f4. Trying to get the rook on f1 opened up, and the point of this could be that if e takes f4 is played, then you could play bishop takes f4 and try to get some activity this way, And basically with this rook on the open f file, white is going to have a lot of easy times either trying to get a rook lift and bring the rook to b3, or just getting the rook active in general. So e takes f4 would just give too much activity for white, so instead bishop c7. At least saying that if f takes e5 is now played, then Reshevsky is okay with just playing queen takes e5 and perhaps trading a bit of material off the board. b3 was played, and now f6. F takes e5 and queen e6. And Reshevsky knows that, of course, the pawn cannot capture the pawn on f6 because the queen is hanging. So he's going to basically put his queen here and capture the pawn a bit later. And if white ever thinks about playing a move like queen takes g7, then there are always ideas like bringing a rook to the g8 square and putting a lot of pressure on g2 and the king in general. So h3, rook h to g8, of course defending the g7 pawn, bishop d4, and knight takes e5. Now, you are now threatening moves such as knight takes c4 as black, so queen c3 was played, defending the bishop and also getting out of the reach of the c7 bishop. And here, Reshevsky plays knight d7. And what Reshevsky is trying to do is somehow bring his knight into an active square. He could try to be playing the move knight b8 and then knight to a6 and somehow grab his knight a good square from there, but for now it's a bit harder to do. c5, rook g e8, and now b4. And we can tell that Alekhine is preparing a very good attack. We can see that if there's moves like b5 and then b takes c6 executed, then Reshevsky's king is just busted. So he plays knight b8. And his idea is to try to, maybe if b5 is played, then play c takes b5. And now if you try something like knight b6 check, then after bishop takes b6, c takes b6, black can actually just block this with knight c6. And okay, the position is still at risk, but it's certainly a fine position for black to play. But instead of playing the move b5, we have knight b6 check immediately. And after bishop takes b6, c takes b6, queen takes a2. Now this is a very risky decision, mainly because, first of all, the a file is completely open for white to use. And secondly, because even though the queen has just captured another pawn, that pawn was not really doing anything on the a2 square. So now queen g3 by Alekhine. And here he's starting his attack. And he's not going to spare Reshevsky for being very greedy. So rook d7, obviously we could see there was a threat of queen c7 mate. And bishop c5. And obviously if rook takes d1 is played, then there's just queen c7 and that is checkmate. So rook takes d1 is unplayable, instead queen f7. Trying to guard the rook on d7, and of course now if rook takes d7 is played, queen takes d7 is going to be played, and maybe black has chances, he can play knight a6, guard the c7 square that way, and it's not much, but even if a passive position is worth this, then maybe Reshevsky can try to hold on somehow. So, not playing rook takes d7, rook to a1, trying to go on the a file. And here, queen g6 was played. Reshevsky knows that if he trades the queens off, then it certainly will be good for him. And after queen h2, maintaining the queen on this diagonal, there are obviously threats of rook a8 and infiltrating that way. So here, Reshevsky played a move which I don't think was the best idea. He played rook e5. Many people would probably be thinking, why not just play the move knight e6? Because it does, after all, block this rook from coming to a8. But knight a6 is not a strong enough move to hold off against this rook. For instance, b5, and obviously you can't capture on c5 because this rook would infiltrate via a8. So c takes b5, and after c takes b5 is played, rook fc1. And all of the pieces are coming to the open files, and Reshevsky's king is toast. So that is why it's not a good idea to even consider knight a6, mainly because after b5 you have to capture the pawn on b5, and you can't really move the knight anywhere else where it's secure. You could play knight b8 and after rook a8 try rook to e5, but this essentially just transposes to what happened in the game. So we have queen h2 and now rook to e5. And now rook a8 is played. And here, unfortunately, there was a big mistake that was played by Reshevsky, Maybe if Reshevsky played a move like queen to d3, this position could be a bit better, or maybe if he tried queen e4 or queen g5, something that could either guard the d8 square or this rook on e5, then maybe he would have had a better chance. But unfortunately, Reshevsky played the move rook d2, and now it's already lost. So I encourage you to pause the video and find the way that Alekhine just won the game on the spot. Okay, so Alekhine played a very wonderful move, and this is one of my favorite moves that he's ever played. Rook takes b8 check. And this move is basically trying to put the king on the b file. And it's also trying to make sure that the king can barely escape from that b8 square. So king takes b8 was played, and finally, the final touch that Alekhine used, queen takes e5 check. And after this move was played, Reshevsky actually resigned the game. There's no way you can defend against checkmate, because if you play f takes e5, then there's rook f8 check, and you would have to block with the queen and then the rook, and then you're essentially going to get checkmated. And if you don't accept the queen, and if you just play something like king a8, then you're basically giving white tons and tons of opportunities of checkmating you. For instance, if you play king c8, then first of all, you're just going to get checkmated this way, and if you play king to a8, you're just down a piece, and after rook a1 check, you're going to lose this rook, and this is even checkmate now. So there's absolutely nothing for Reshevsky to do after rook takes b8 check was played, and that's why he should have played something like queen to e4. And why I say this is because if he did this, after queen e4, you're defending the rook on e5. So now after rook takes b8 check, king takes b8, the same combination doesn't work because there's queen takes e5, defending the rook on e5. And the same thing goes when you just play the move queen to d3, because when you do this, it defends the d file. So now, again, if you tried the same combination, then it fails because of, after all of this, rook to d8, and the queen guards the rook. So there is nothing that white has even achieved. So it was a very unfortunate game for Reshevsky, but it's a very nice one for Alekhine. And I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.